Welcome to the LowCarbMD podcast. No one is beyond help. No one is beyond hope.
As we have always said, we are bringing you medical information and cutting-edge science, but none of this is medical advice. Please seek out input from your own doctor.
Hello and welcome to the LowCarbMD podcast. I'm sitting down for this one because I can't lose any brain power with these three guys I have on. This is a meeting of the minds, and I am really excited about this. So we have a new kid on the block, Nick Norwitz, who he's been on my other podcast, and he's been on LowCarbMD hopefully by now. Ben Bocchicchio is one of my favorite guys on earth. He's a muscle guy, but he knows biochemistry like crazy. And some kid named Ben Bikman. He's new on the scene. He's a guy from BYU, and all these guys have degrees from all these fancy places that rejected me right away. But I think this is an important topic. This is I'm the clinician here so far, until the young guy Nick starts stepping up the ladder. But I've been making some observations, and it's really amazing. So I wanted to get the scientists to say, okay, Brian, you're wrong. Here's what we see. This makes sense. What I've seen is combining a low carb or ketogenic diet with Ben's type workout, Ben Bocchicchio's type workout is it's a powerhouse for metabolic health. So the reason this came, first of all, was personal experience. What happened was I've always struggled with my weight. My wife, January, we both go on a diet together. We eat the same thing. She's thin and fit. So she has no visceral fat. She loses weight very quickly and I don't. So I was like, this is weird. Why is it that I have twice the muscle mass and twice the mass, and it doesn't make sense if we're eating the same things, and I should be losing weight faster than her, and I'm not. Usually it's the guy who loses a bunch of weight. But what I've noticed in my clinical practice is guys with a big belly and no muscle, thin arms and legs with a big belly, 13 liters of visceral fat, don't lose weight. They lose it very slowly. The wife who's 168 pounds with more muscle mass loses weight 4 pounds, 2 pounds, 6 pounds. He's losing 0.8, 0.4, 0.9. And I'm like, this is crazy. But what I've found is that they're losing inches around their waist, meaning visceral fat is going down, but the weight's not changing on the scale. So maybe we're looking at the wrong marker. And I did a little bit of research on this stuff. And then I reach out to the three smart guys and say, okay, Fat Ben, he's not fat, but he knows all about fat. And the other Ben knows all about muscle. How are these interacting? And why is it that it seems that visceral fat behaves differently than subcutaneous fat? So I'll let you experts take the wheel. I'll let who wants to go first, man?
I have a question that I want to open with.
Yes.
Because this is something that I have.
This is my podcast, dude. What are you doing, man?
But the question I want to open with is, Ben, what do you think the evolutionary purpose of visceral fat is? Because sub-Q has a lot of benefits. What is the purpose evolutionarily of visceral fat?
Ben, you want to take that? But I mean, I have no idea. But
I'll take it.
Sure.
No, I'm just kidding. You go, Ben.
Well, first of all, there are very genuine differences when it comes to adipocyte biology in the visceral adipocytes versus subcutaneous, and we can elaborate on those in a bit. But I believe the role of visceral fat, we always say that it's like insulation or like shock absorption. I believe that it is more a function of the immune system, given the movement of blood flow, where visceral fat is often receiving blood from the guts. It's in some instances the first tissue to see blood as it's flowed through the guts, as you imagine this sort of venous flow. And then visceral fat feeds to the liver, which puts it in a position of potentially damaging the liver, but it also puts it in a position of helping get rid of things well. And that is why visceral fat can accumulate macrophages so readily. I believe it is evolutionarily, if we look at it in that way, or just simply in this moment in time, our guts are dirty places, and they represent one of the three, direct interactions of the host with environment: skin, lung, and gastrointestinal tract. And so those have to have robust immune systems. And as you imagine, the movement of molecules coming into gastrointestinal blood, going through some of that visceral fat, and then moving to the liver, who's the great expunger of all things filthy. That's my 2 bits on why. Now I'm quick to say I can talk more authoritatively about the what when it comes to what are the differences between visceral and subcutaneous. But this question, Nick, that you've posed, I joke with my students that, and no one, please don't take this too far. I joke these why questions. I say these are divine questions, because I say God only knows why the body, or Mother Nature, if we want to invoke something other than God as intelligent design, or however we came to be who we are. The why question is philosophical, which is fun. It's fun to philosophize, and I can only add my opinion, and that is how I expressed it. But there are other, there's more definitive differences that I know and I can speak to more with more authority than this. So that's my 2 bits. Okay. I believe it's immune related.
All right.
What is it? We'll let Benny go.
Ben, do you I mean, it seems, if we're going on that route, we're going evolutionarily. I mean, the amount of visceral fat and the problems we're having with visceral fat in modern day metabolic, issues. And I mean, it would seem to me that, okay, so the explanation you gave is a reasonable, basically we're making these assumptions. Okay, it's a reasonable assumption. How does that relate to the fact that I think we know in the development of fat, or the accumulation of fat, or the storage of energy in fat, that visceral fat seems to be kind of a last resort, kind of an overflow pool. Is that not the case? I mean,
well, I don't want to say so. Vinny, you'd be saying that the visceral fat would be getting fat once subcutaneous fat has reached its limit. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, isn't there some kind of a correlation to that process?
Well, I don't know, and I would say I don't think it has to be that way. There was a human study that looked at, it was isocaloric drinks of glucose versus fructose, and they noted that both groups gained an equal amount of fat, but where they stored fat became very it departed from each other. The glucose drinking solution had a selective increase in subcutaneous fat. The fructose drinking solution, they had more of a visceral, and so I would say it doesn't have to happen that way. Not that it couldn't.
But you can direct it. You can direct the energy based on what you're eating.
You can do things to direct where you're storing that fat. So why would someone be accumulating more fat now? I would say partly it could be diet. We know that part of the fundamental differences between visceral adipocytes and subcutaneous is that the visceral adipocytes have a greater sensitivity to cortisol. Where cortisol will literally increase lipoprotein lipase expression at visceral adipocytes, while reducing lipoprotein lipase expression in subcutaneous adipocytes. That's why someone with Cushing's disease, they manifest with such a unique change in their body fat, where it's like you're stripping the fat from all their limbs in a way, and then you store it centrally. And so there are differences in responsive in sensitivity to, like, say, cortisol as an example, that might in some instances explain why someone's expanding their visceral fat more than someone else.
Okay,
being stressed and worried and all those kind of things.
And I think pair feeding experiments in mice.
If we take that proposition that you just, and I think it makes sense, Brian, then why are we seeing clinically that the visceral fat seems to be a stepping stone that we have to hurdle before we get to subcutaneous fat in many cases? Am I describing that?
Yeah, it seems like that clinically, but then that's why I have you guys together, because to me, I'm not sure, because I see people with more visceral fat have more trouble losing weight. But it seems that when and we have data on this, that as they lose visceral fat, they're putting muscle mass on, and maybe at the same rate or somewhere close. So we're not seeing it on the scale, but we're seeing the inches. They're losing the visceral fat, but their weight's not changing. Well, that's why people give up. They go, I tried this diet for a month, it didn't work. Well, your clothes were looser.
Yeah. Well, the body, so visceral adipocytes more readily activate, or have more activated readily, lipolysis than subcutaneous. So cell for cell, a visceral adipocyte is far more inclined to activate lipolysis than a subcutaneous adipocyte is. So, Brian, when you are noticing an individual who maybe he still has as much to pinch and jiggle as he did before, and yet the waistline is getting smaller, reflective of a reduction in visceral fat, that to me fits the cell biology perfectly. And I know sometimes there is a separation between what the cell is doing and what we see in a whole body or a physiological view, but visceral adipocytes engage in lipolysis far more readily than subcutaneous adipocytes. And I think that is itself a reflection of the differences in purpose, whereas subcutaneous adipocytes are a genuine storage depot, and of course doing far more than that. As Nick, you alluded to, we have very clear understanding of what, and more all the time, of what subcutaneous adipocytes are doing. Visceral adipocytes, I don't think were ever intended to be a storage depot for fuel. I think that is something that, whether it is more immune related or not, regardless, the body is very inclined to get rid of that. So visceral adipose will break down its triglycerides much faster than subcutaneous adipocytes will.
And we'll let Nick jump in, man, the young guy, because
I want to take a neuro perspective. Okay. From this,
I want you to jump in,
kinda...
Nick, because Nick has a condition where his body preferentially pours his extra energy into visceral fat rather than the subcutaneous, so he could be absolutely cut and put have increased visceral fat, which is interesting.
You and I have talked about that, and me and Ben Bow has talked about that, actually, about some people have genetic variants. I have one that causes me to just store visceral fat more. It's an LRP5 gene, but it was funny. We were doing, me and my friends, research on athletes at Oxford, and we'd have like these like pro cyclists and semi-pro cyclists come in and do 7-point caliper measurements on them for body fat, and they come in at like, I don't know, 40, 60 millimeters, and we did me, and it was like 19, 20, and then I would get on bioimpedance scales, and none of them can register me, no matter, like, they never have been able to. But if I get a DEXA scan, I have 15% body fat, which is not, I mean, it's low, but it's not like low. And my visceral fat is similar to my mom's, despite her having, like, more total fat. It's just, there are genetic differences. So there are people like me who do preferentially store TOFIs, I guess. But getting back onto the mechanisms things, there was this paper in Nature Communications. It was short, just like 3 pages, by Coleman et al. And it was really interesting. It was talking about brain insulin resistance to the hypothalamus, contributing to a failure of people being able to lose weight, in particular visceral fat, after lifestyle intervention. So there was a 24-month lifestyle intervention, and then there was a 9-year follow-up. And they measured brain insulin sensitivity, like, at baseline. And the theory was that the brain is going to be the master regulator of how the body partitions fuel and partitions fat. And persons with high baseline insulin resistance in their brain had a proclivity towards gaining more fat back, but also preferentially gaining more visceral fat back, which was interesting. And so high brain insulin sensitivity at baseline correlated with lower visceral fat at 24 months and at 9 years. And that was independent of BMI, which was interesting. So I think there's like this probably bidirectional relationship where visceral fat and TRPR2 are contributing to insulin resistance, and then it just circles back around.
Can we all agree that BMI is a useless marker?
Absolutely.
Yep.
Does anyone disagree with that, of the 3 expert guys I have here assembled?
It's a very weak proxy for other things.
Well, Nick, I think Ben can speak to that with the insulin situation. What's the correlation, Ben, to brain insulin sensitivity / resistance and whole body? I mean, isn't there a direct correlation, or
well, yeah, that's. In fact, I was a co-author on a manuscript that identified some degree of hypothalamic insulin resistance, and so you think I'd be more of an expert on this. I would imagine that hypothalamic insulin resistance would tend to trend as the body or the system is becoming insulin resistant, but I don't know.
Okay.
I would say in clinical instances of insulin resistance, I would be shocked if there were ever an instance of insulin resistance that wasn't starting in the adipocyte. So I'm very much a fat first advocate. So I wish I could speak to that idea. Now, Nick, that's an intriguing series of observations. I can't help but wonder, and I'm afraid I just don't know, to what degree does the vagus innervate have an influence on subcutaneous fat versus visceral fat, and might some hypothalamic anomaly that we see connecting more with visceral lipid accumulation or adipocyte growth. I can't help but wonder whether there is some influence of the vagus nerve, but I just don't know the anatomy of the vagus nerve well enough.
I think it's a good hypothesis. I mean, this was a recent 2020 study, so I don't think the mechanisms have been sussed out. As for peripheral insulin resistance and cerebral, my understanding is that you can definitely have cerebral insulin resistance without peripheral, as in certain conditions like Alzheimer's disease. But if you have peripheral, you basically have cerebral as well.
Well, Nick, I think I see what you're saying, but even in Alzheimer's, I would say the study from Finland, they noted the fasting insulin was more of a predictive correlative variable than age was. And so I do think, I very much am an advocate of the idea that part of the pathology with Alzheimer's disease is absolutely an insulin resistance of some of those brain cells compromising glucose uptake. But I do still think that's happening in the midst of some degree of peripheral insulin resistance. That but I don't know. I don't know of evidence to confirm or deny, to be honest.
There are mechanisms by which it can happen selectively in the brain, like the ApoE4 variant that confers risk for Alzheimer's disease actually traps insulin receptors in endosomes in the brain. And I don't know if in the periphery it's the same physiology.
Yeah,
so
you're right. That's a good point.
I agree with you. I think fasting insulin would be a better proxy. But
that's a good point, though. Excellent point.
Brian, do you want to get this back on?
Yeah, no, I want to step back for just a second here.
Because we're getting deep in the weeds here.
No. I think I just want to step back evolutionary wise. I'm thinking like visceral fat. I think two things. I think one is it's our last ditch effort before getting diabetes, because once you fill up your visceral fat and subcutaneous fat, where do you put the energy after that? That's the way I'm thinking of it. And so I'm looking at it from the perspective of all of us who've lost weight, gained weight, lost weight. Every time it gets harder and harder with time. So by the time they get to me, they've done, liquid diets. They've tried all these other things on the market as a calorie restriction. So the way I'm looking at visceral fat, and the reason is I think it's hard to give up, is it's like our last bank account to keep us from going bankrupt. So your body wants to hold on to that last bit of money because you've starved it so many times before. And historically, we've died of starvation rather than oversupply of energy. We're in a new problem for our bodies that our body's not used to dealing with.
That's an interesting. It's interesting you say that with respect to what Ben said earlier. Ben, I really liked both Bens, but Ben Bikman, what you said about visceral fat and the immune system, because you're talking about the barriers to entry of the body. Obviously, you want a potent immune response at an entry point, and visceral fat is near an entry point. So there's going to be crosstalk with the microbiome. And then what you said, Brian, people that come to you that lose weight, gain weight, lose weight, gain weight. I know it's been shown, I think this was another Nature paper in 2015, that when you go through cycles, like yo-yo dieting, each cycle, the obesogenic fingerprint on your microbiome is reinforced. So when you refeed, like you gain weight more quickly because your microbiome is still obese. Then you lose weight, but you still have that frugal microbiome, and it just kind of accelerates over time. So I'm not sure what crosstalk that would have with visceral fat, but I'm sure there is some, or I hypothesize there is some.
Yeah, and I think a lot of what Ben's saying, well, we're going to have Ben Bocchicchio Benbo from now on, and then we have our other Ben, right? So Dr. Bikman, he always makes you call him a doctor, but except on the podcast,
stop.
Ben. So what's interesting, stepping back.
I am the enemy of formality.
I know that.
I could meet the most important person in the
world.
world.
Wait till you guys hear.
I would immediately go first name basis until I was removed from polite society.
Wait to hear what Ben was saying on my other podcast. It's going to be worth the money. Trust me, it's free, but it's worth the money still. But so when I first met Ben Bocchicchio, Benbo over here, he's a muscle guy. He looks like Stallone, and he's like, goes, yeah, muscle's the #1 determiner of longevity. You have more muscle mass, you live longer. I was like, what is muscle? You're carrying heavy stuff around. This other Ben, professor at BYU, says, well, it's visceral fat. If you keep lower visceral fat, low insulin, you live longer. You guys are 100% in agreement. I think the problem is that
Oh,
we get
yeah.
older, we get visceral fat, which inhibits muscle mass. You lose muscle mass, you put on visceral fat. It's a chicken and egg type thing. So I'd love to hear you guys talk about this interaction between, because what happens, I'll tell you clinically, I have people who fast and they kill it. I have people who do weights and they kill it, right? So what I'm seeing is and Ben's the expert on this stuff, but Ben Bo is the expert on this one. Interleukin 6, interleukin 10. He's talking about interleukin 15, breaking down the visceral fat, releasing energy so that your muscles can use it. Fasting works by a different mechanism, it looks like. So I think those two mechanisms may make the muscle and the adipose tissue interactions that much better. So I would love to hear you guys' perspective on this clinically.
Well, one direction I think I'd like to go in, since I know a lot about this stuff, is that basically exercise, or actually to be more specific recruitment patterns of muscle stimulation and different fiber types, selective fiber types, induce a huge anti-inflammatory response, global and local, okay? So my point is that this is something, I mean, these are mechanisms that are well-founded in the literature, and I think we would all agree that if we can reduce inflammation, if we can provide an anti-inflammatory mechanism that's not a drug or that doesn't have side effects, that it would be worth paying attention to. And that's kind of where I'm coming from with interleukin 6. By the way, interleukin 6 can pass through the blood-brain barrier, okay? And so it may have something to do, and it is anti-inflammatory. Controls glucose, and things like that. So, and this interleukin 15, which I think is a kind of newer one. Are you familiar with that at all, Ben,
No,
I
not 15. I'm not.
a little bit, but wait, can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
My understanding is IL-10 is anti-inflammatory. IL-6 is more pro-inflammatory.
Well, it's either. It's both. It can be both.
Exactly. That depends from where it originates, and it also mostly depends on its proportion or ratio to TNF alpha and IL-1. Okay. So from the muscle, okay, the proportion, in fact, I did a study at Johns Hopkins, called me in, we did a study on juvenile arthritis patients who measured interleukin 6. Okay, they did my exercise protocol, which is slow, controlled, because the kids had pain moving, but they had no pain doing slow exercise. And we increased muscle-mediated IL-6 to the point where it was hugely inflammatory, and it actually produces a decrease, okay, inhibitors to TNF alpha and IL-1 when it's initiated in the muscle from exercise, mostly from type 2B fibers, by the way. That's another thing. Now, this interleukin 15 is a fascinating one because it specifically sends signals to reduce visceral fat while enhancing protein synthesis and muscle growth. Okay, and most of the receptors for that are in the type 2B muscle fibers, twice as many as in the other muscle fibers. So that's the kind of stuff that I'm looking at, because I'm trying to, when I got into this whole low carb thing, the first meeting I went to, nobody said anything about exercise. And they're talking about losing fat basically as one of the primary objectives. And I'm saying, how is nobody talking about exercise? And they're talking about inflammation. I'm saying, how is nobody talking about exercise, and a specific kind of exercise and a specific kind of stimulation of muscle fibers that send these signals and instigate these pathways?
Yeah.
That's kind of where I'm coming from.
I agree with you, and I also think that I was reading recently that resistance training or strength training is better than endurance training for losing visceral fat. They did like a 21-day study where they were comparing the two, and I think there was 18% visceral fat loss versus 12%. So 18% in the resistance train, 12% in the endurance train. But with respect to IL-6, have you read the molecular choreography of exercise paper? I think we talked about it a little bit. I think I did.
Yeah.
The one with the fitness inflammatory signature. So the whole thing that they characterized in this paper was that there's this kind of 50-minute window after exercise in insulin-sensitive individuals where there's a spike in inflammatory mediators, including IL-6. And then that is followed by a big anti-inflammatory wave, for its compensation. But with respect to IL-6, IL-6 is in that signature, and it would be muscle derived. However, IL-6 from Like IL-6 positively correlates with visceral fat in general if you just take a baseline serum. So this is more reinforcing your point than anything, that the question that the timing and the origin do seem to matter.
Well, understanding, this is another one of my points, is that you have to differentiate between local and global responses. So when we initiate this local response, and we do cause some inflammation with exercise, okay, no question, the global response is overwhelmingly anti-inflammatory. Okay.
After 15 minutes.
Well, whatever the time frame is. I mean, so the response, all right, the response, Nikki, is anti-inflammatory. We know that to produce muscle growth, there are things that happen like specific LDH and things like that. These are a little bit inflammatory, but that inflammation, that irritation is really stimulatory to a healthy anti-inflammatory global response. That should make sense, no?
Mm-hmm.
Ben?
That's what I was, yeah, I agree.
Does that make sense, Ben?
Yeah. I've loved this conversation. It's fun fun learning some of this. So Brian, I'll make one additional point. I think it's astute, and I like you pointing out that Ben has a more muscle-centric view of longevity. I have an adipocyte-centric view. They certainly are both relevant and real. I would say there's no question maintaining muscle mass is one of the best predictors of longevity. I think it's also safe to say, based on a study where the title is almost exactly something like insulin sensitivity is a fundamental feature of familial longevity. What's so interesting about both is the loss of something, because in aging, of course, you're trying to prevent the loss of muscle. One thing that's so interesting about adipocytes, one of the reasons we think people become more insulin sensitive as they age, and this would certainly play into muscle mass loss, because that matters with regards to insulin sensitivity. Muscle is the main consumer of glucose by a wide margin in the body. But as we age, we stop being able to replace adipocytes that died. When an adipocyte undergoes apoptosis, in the early phase of life, so the number of fat cells we have is settled in most individuals, almost all people. The number of fat cells they have is done when they've finished puberty.
Ben, are you talking subcutaneous or visceral?
I'm talking any adipocyte.
All
number.
adipocytes.
Yeah, but I think it would most certainly apply to subcutaneous. And the degree to which it actually applies to visceral, I don't know actually. This was data from subcutaneous adipocytes. So that number is set with the end of puberty. And then we replace a fat cell every 10 years, where a fat cell dies 10 years and it gets replaced by a new fat cell that basically just carries that lipid burden or droplet that the previous one. But as we age, we lose that ability. Our ability to turn over and create new fat cells starts to become compromised. And that is a problem, paradoxically, for insulin sensitivity, because a person's ability to stay insulin sensitive is very intimately connected to their ability to store fat in fat cells. Most certainly, of course, subcutaneous fat cells. And so part of the problem, this kind of provocative paradigm, is, can you get fat enough to avoid insulin sensitivity? And of course, that's that threshold that everyone inherently has. But as we age, assuming our dietary habits are continuing to want to store fat the same way they were before, as we are now literally losing a fat cell number, we have our fat cell number declining, our fat cell population, our threshold becomes lower, or our body becomes more sensitive to storing fat. We've lost some of that ability, and then we have that spillover or lipotoxicity, whatever we want to call it, and the body starts to becoming, or at the very least, the fat cells that remain are forced to carry a larger lipid burden. They become more hypertrophied, and it is the hypertrophic fat cell that is the sick fat cell. And again, they're forced to carry that burden as fat cell number is declining. And then they become insulin resistant. It's promoting insulin resistance throughout the body, most certainly in the muscles. And when the muscle becomes insulin resistant, in addition to a myriad other consequences, you lose insulin's protective effect. I'm not going to say anabolic effect, because I think there's nuance there. The muscle loses insulin's protective effect, because while the role of insulin in promoting muscle protein synthesis is very debated, what's very clear is that insulin defends muscle protein. It inhibits proteolysis. If it isn't necessarily forcing the building of the protein in the first place, it certainly is attempting to defend it.
And ketones are the same, right? Protect muscle.
Well, ketones protect muscle in a very indirect way. People invoke that idea, I think, somewhat incorrectly. But let me come back to that idea. So we have the muscle that becomes insulin resistant, perhaps because the fat cells couldn't do their job, and now we have this risk of sarcopenic obesity. And then, Brian, the idea of saying ketones are muscle sparing, that is simply a result of the fact that if we have enough fat tissue to make ketones, then we don't need amino acids from muscle to make it glucose, because we have enough fat-derived ketones to fuel the brain, and the brain doesn't have to be fueled by complete glucose, which would be proteolytically derived from the muscle. But that to me is the difference between fasting and starvation. You can fast for days. A fast becomes starvation when you've run out of fat, and now you're cutting muscle entirely for the purpose of gluconeogenesis, because you are literally running out of ketones. You don't have enough fat to continue to make ketones. That's why ketones are muscle sparing.
Well, let me throw a clinical wrinkle to you guys.
I want to ask a practical question, if I just about something Ben said with respect to fat cells and maintaining insulin resistance over the long term, or insulin sensitivity over the long term. So you were talking about you want more small fat cells. You don't want big, large fat cells. Fat stem cells have this receptor on their primary cilia, FFAR4, that binds omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA, which stimulate fat stem cell renewal and hyperplastia over hyperplasia, making you have more small fat cells. So would you speculate, again, this is a speculation question, that having like normal to high levels of omega-3s in your diet could help you maintain insulin sensitivity via that mechanism?
Yeah, I know the exact paper that you're talking about. So yeah, again, to reiterate what you're saying, from the adipocyte biology point of view, omega-3 appears to stimulate adipogenesis, which is now hyperplasia versus hypertrophy. You know, when you can continue to make more fat cells, paradoxically you can get fatter yet stay more insulin sensitive. The degree to which that is happening in the whole organism, I just don't know. I'm inclined to think it would be a very minimal effect, if any. I'm very much an advocate of omega-3s, but the degree to which someone could leverage omega-3s to maintain insulin sensitivity by forcing hyperplasia of adipose and helping mitigate hypertrophy, I just don't know how relevant that would become in the whole body.
All right, I'm gonna throw another wrinkle at you guys. So I have a guy, he lost 44 pounds before coming to me on a liquid diet. Basically, you know, he was starving himself 500 calories a day with a sugar mix, right?
Oh,
so I said, why are you here? And he goes, I can't stand it anymore, man. I want to eat real food. I'm miserable. I'm fighting with my wife. I can't concentrate. He's miserable. So I go, okay, it's going to be hard. This is going to be a hard one, but you're probably going to gain weight. If we put you on a ketogenic diet, right, you've already lost 44 pounds and he still had weight to lose. Definitely what I could tell you for a fact, he was not fat adapted, because when he exercised, his sugars would drop like crazy, right? When he went on a bike ride or anything, I had him on a 24-hour glucose monitor. In 4 months, he lost exactly 0 pounds with my expert advice, right? He lost 0 pounds. He lost 0 pounds in 4 months, but he lost 8 inches off his waist, right?
Wow.
He lost 8 inches off his waist, and his insulin normalized, and his sugars got better, and his triglycerides dropped. Because, and I would love to hear you guys scientifically explain what's happening, and I think I know, but guess what? Now he's losing 3 pounds, 2 pounds, 4 pounds.
Well, you know, in fact, I meant to add this when
He's doing Ben's workout, by the way. I hate to give Ben a plug,
fact,
but that's what
to Ben's point, the value of exercise, one of the key endocrine events during exercise is the increase in catecholamines like epinephrine. We always talk about how epinephrine will activate lipolysis, but guess which fat cells it activates lipolysis in more readily? It's the visceral adipocytes. They are phenomenally more sensitive to epinephrine-induced lipolysis than subcutaneous. So independent of any other hormone signal, which would be coming from the muscle, which Ben can speak to better than me, these myokines that might be influencing this, which I think is wonderful, it's genius. Even in the whole body, one of the prototypical hormones being epinephrine induced during exercise, that will much more selectively stimulate the breakdown of visceral fat than subcutaneous fat.
Unless this is where this is I think the best paper that I've read on visceral fat. Brian, you got me onto it. Was this Liu et al. Paper, 2013? I don't know if you know. It was in Nature Medicine about TRPBR2.
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys are familiar with that one, but what it was saying. So TRPBR2 is a protein that's preferentially expressed in visceral adipose tissue in humans. It correlates positively with triglycerides and insulin, and negatively with HDL. And interestingly, it correlates positively with insulin, independent of visceral adipose tissue mass. So Ben Bikman, I want to get your, or both of you, I want to get your thoughts on that in a minute. But they found that so TRPBR2 knockout mice, when you get rid of the TRPBR2, they're resistant to diet-induced obesity, and they'd have no change in food intake and no change in activity. So they had an increase in mitochondrial biogenesis, increase in thermogenesis. And when they looked into it, the mechanism was this. So the TRPBR2, it's a co-repressor of the genes ADRB3, which codes for beta adrenergic receptor and hormone-sensitive lipase. So what they were kind of showing was that when you have high TRPBR2, you have a decrease in this beta adrenergic receptor. So you're going to be less sensitive. You're not going to be able to have epinephrine-induced lipolysis because there's a decrease in the receptor and a decrease in hormone-sensitive lipase.
Yeah.
Well, then that doesn't speak to exercise. So Nick, I don't think your point is challenging what I'd said. Your point is challenging that the relevance of having to cut the visceral fat before you cut the subcutaneous fat in seeing improvements in insulin sensitivity, right?
My point wasn't countering your point. It was more about the general phenomenon of people with more visceral fat being somewhat resistant to, say, exercise-induced weight loss.
Oh, no, and I'm not saying that. I'm just saying the visceral fat would be more sensitive to the endocrine, to the epinephrine-induced lipolysis. Right. But Nick, that's awesome. I'm thrilled to learn that. One problem with mouse models studying visceral versus subcutaneous is that mice have almost no subcutaneous depot. They have that teeny little inguinal fat strip that goes down like the inguinal canal area. Otherwise, they have like no capacity. All their fat is always visceral. You know, it's the perirenal. It's always this visceral adipose. But the point I think is valid. But when it comes to comparing visceral versus subcutaneous differences, I think a rodent model has inherent problems because they just don't really have subcutaneous depots, whereas in the human, that's the primary depot.
Wow, that's interesting. That's
Brian,
interesting.
I think one of the things maybe we can address, because we had talked about it, and Ben and Nikki do, what is the fat distribution type as, brown versus white, and is there any difference between visceral and subcutaneous? Anybody have any ideas?
Yeah, Bikman, I'll let him take that one.
Well, okay.
Yeah.
I taught him all this stuff, so we'll let him talk about it.
Yeah, let me quote Brian.
Oh my God.
Said no one ever. I'm just kidding. I'm kidding.
My wife quotes me, but it's not good.
I know exactly. Yeah, and my kids only quote me when it was something I shouldn't have said in the first place.
Yep.
So we did a test in rodents looking at depots, 3 depots, the actual interscapular brown adipose in the animal, which is where they have it. Now, again, it's funny, though, because I just sort of informed Nick that it's hard to make these depot-specific comparisons. Now I'm about to do it. But indulge me, and then Nick, you chastise me once I get done. So we measured the interscapular brown adipose, and we measured mitochondrial function in each of them. That was the main outcome. Then we measured the subcutaneous, which in the animal is that inguinal, those inguinal strips of fat. And then we measured, I think it was perirenal as an indication, as sort of a corollary of visceral fat in humans. But again, it's problematic. We found that insulin selectively reduced the mitochondrial respiration. It dampened metabolic rate in the brown adipose tissue and in the visceral adipose tissue. Subcutaneous, but not visceral. We found almost opposite with ketones. Ketones had no effect on stimulating mitochondrial uncoupling in visceral adipocytes, but it made the subcutaneous adipocytes more uncoupled In other words, making it more like the brown adipocytes, although never to that level. What's so interesting about brown adipocytes is that mitochondrion for mitochondrion, they have a metabolic rate that rivals skeletal muscle at rest, mind you. Not the active. We can't study active skeletal muscle in our model. But the brown adipose tissue looks like skeletal muscle. And then the white adipose tissue is just, it's almost at the level of detection. It's so, I mean, it's barely above the level of detection. But when it's been exposed to ketones, you triple it, basically. It still doesn't get to the level of the brown adipose, but subcutaneous fat can become more uncoupled, making it more like brown. And I don't know of evidence to suggest visceral can do that.
Oh, that's really intriguing, because
So
you know what I'm finding in this guy, like he had to burn through a bunch of visceral fat. He put on muscle mass, burned through his visceral fat. Now he's losing weight quickly, and so it may be that he's getting some of this uncoupling in his subcutaneous fat. That's why I'm stepping back and I'm saying, look, I'm seeing people with less visceral fat to start with and more subcutaneous fat. They lose weight very quickly. I mean, comparatively speaking, than the guy with the big beer gut and hardly any muscle. So I think what I'm looking for is the solution of saying, okay, one other question along these lines is it appears that as people are, and Dr. Sean O'Meara had data on this with MRI scans of the abdomen, as people lost visceral fat, muscle mass went up. Skeletal and intra-abdominal muscle mass goes up. So what I'm saying is people are looking at the scale, and that may be the wrong marker, and there has to be something. And the reason I'm looking at this, Ben, you may have heard me talk about it before, is when I look at a bear, what do? They put on a ton of visceral fat and they lose their muscle mass so that they can hibernate for 6 months. So if they had a ton of muscle mass, they would burn through their visceral fat too quickly. So that what that tells me is, like, I'd rather be a lion like Sean Baker than be a bear.
Oh yeah, for sure. Sean's a freaking machine, for the record. You know, Brian, I that is such an interesting observation to note, and I don't know that to note the reduction in visceral fat occurring in parallel with an increase in muscle mass. Does this happen even in the absence of the person exercising, or are they also exercising?
Sean O'Meara has in the absence of exercise, and because I'm trying to look smart, I have them do Ben's workout or some kind of exercise. And the other thing is this, and Nick will back me on this because I think I sent him the study. They took people and they did a 12-week exercise program, right? And so one group, they did nothing. The other group, they gave them an interleukin-6 blocker. They did not lose visceral fat, and their LDL went up. So they exercised the same. So they burned the same amount of calories, but they didn't lose visceral fat when the interleukin-6 was there. Right, blocker. Is that right, Nick? Did you see that study?
I asked you to send it to me. You never sent it.
Oh.
Okay. If I did send it, you would see. I have it here. I could send it to you guys. I was intrigued by that because I was thinking, oh my goodness, because that makes a difference. And clinically, we have medicines blocking interleukin.
This was a human study?
Human study.
How fascinating. Yeah, you don't keep that to yourself.
How did they not? I'm like, how does no one see this study? I don't even know what I'm doing. You guys have 3 scientists here, and I'm like, so I was looking at going, that's very intriguing to me. Like that argues against the calories in, calories out. That's a hormonal shift.
Well, it even challenges what I'd mentioned earlier about how visceral adipocytes are so sensitive to epinephrine. Well, here, so much for epinephrine. If you block interleukin-6 and now it's not doing, I mean, that's a very novel paradigm.
Yeah. So anyways, that's one thing that I'm finding intriguing, saying, okay, I can, what I'm seeing clinically is when people fast, or they do Ben's workout, or they're active or walk, whatever, they're doing better than people who do one or the other. That's why when I saw Ben at the conference come in with a cutoff shirt and shorts, I'm like, who the heck is this guy, right? He's saying you can work out 15 minutes and get the same effect as running on the treadmill 45 minutes a day, 15 minutes twice a week. I said, that's garbage, right? Until I started looking at his data, I go, oh, this knucklehead may be right on this stuff. And he may be right on the muscle. If the muscle is inhibitory to visceral fat, and visceral fat's inhibitory to muscle, what we don't want to do is get a bunch of visceral fat and not have muscle mass. That's what we don't want to do. We're like the bear in that case. I'd rather be like the lion who has, like Sean Baker, with no visceral fat, 0 coronary calcium score, right? So you start looking at that, and I think the reason I wanted all 3 of you together is like, is there a possibility that we say we can come to some conclusion at some point of saying, hey, the lower your visceral fat is as you age, and here's the other kicker for this, based on my review of the literature, was this: as we get older, we lose like the estrogen, progesterone are shifting the energy towards subcutaneous fat. Once women reach menopause or men stop making as much testosterone, we have a shift from that subcutaneous to visceral fat. That's when cardiac disease, all these things that we're seeing that are a disaster that in your book you so eloquently discussed, go up. Once we get a lot of visceral fat. And the other thing, going back to what Nick said, the reason that study was so intriguing to me with this TRPBR2, which comes from visceral fat, is if you block that, you block the cytokine storm from COVID-19 deaths in seniors and people with a ton of visceral fat. So what the reason it's so important to me is that this is telling me that how critical metabolic health is, which you talked about in your book, what Ben's talking about, what Nick is talking about. We're all talking about the same thing, maybe from different angles. That's why I wanted all four of us on the same podcast to discuss this.
No. There's a lot of interplay between TRPBR2 and inflammation bidirectionally. I know ER stress, even diet-induced ER stress, at least in mice, induces TRPBR2 activation.
Endoplasmic reticulum.
So I wasn't able to find too much in the literature on TRPBR2 specifically. There was like one Louis et al. Paper, but one question I want to bring up with regards to biomarkers is like it's hard as a for you as a clinician to be measuring fat.
Oh, Nick, you cut out just for a second.
You also use what else do you use?
Nick, you cut out. You cut out.
Well, I'll just. Am I here? I'll just cut to the chase. I'll just cut to the chase with my question. I was reading a little bit about resistin, and it seemed to be kind of a node in this puzzle. I mean, alcohol, even at least in mouse models, even when mice are losing weight, if they're having alcohol, it increases resistin. Inflammatory diets can lead to LPS, which increases resistin, and those both, resistin correlates very nicely with visceral adipose tissue. They did a study in fasting Ramadan population, and it was the main correlate of visceral adipose tissue. So I don't know what you guys, Ben, know about. Probably know a lot about resistin, and what your thoughts are is how it fits into this puzzle.
No, I don't actually. I know it's an adipokine that is that appears to be part of one of the contributing variables to insulin resistance, but I don't know the state under which its release is altered from an adipocyte.
Yeah, I don't either, honestly. One comment, Ben, on you said the catecholamines, and somebody said the IL-6 didn't have any. They didn't respond. The people had IL-6 knockout, but adrenaline is upstream of IL-6 production in the process. No,
I don't know.
Well, yeah. Well, I think I do.
In fact, well, tell me, what do you mean?
In other words, when we exercise and we produce this IL-6, okay, then when we produce this adrenaline response, okay, when we deplete glycogen, and I even believe this to be the case, when we threaten to deplete glycogen at an enormous rate, even though we don't obviously deplete glycogen in all of it, I think the response is this adrenaline response to say, whoa, I better get some backup fuel to this life and death fight or flight fuel that's being dissipated at such an enormous rate. And we get that adrenaline response, which then triggers the release of free fatty acid. Okay. And so I think the IL-6 is produced by that contraction, or that series of contractions, or that exposure to muscle stimulation. And then, but as a result of and one of the results of that stimulation, that process, is that IL-6 is therefore, after this adrenaline response drives this effort, is an IL-6 release.
So Ben, you're saying, so I know of the phenomenon that epinephrine will stimulate IL-6.
Right.
Like if you infuse epinephrine, you'll see a bump in IL-6. Is that what you're touching on?
I mean, I think it's upstream. Yeah, it happens before, right, as a result of.
Yeah, so maybe, I see what you're saying. Yeah, okay. So you're suggesting that IL-6 might just be a necessary partner in epinephrine-induced lipolysis. Is that what you're touching?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
Yeah, well, I'd say Nick's data, that paper he cited, would certainly support that paradigm.
Yeah.
I think the Brian's paper was the IL-6 one, but my one, the mouse one, was the ARD B3, so the beta androgen receptor within the visceral, so unless there could be a autocrine response where you're stimulating it and maybe you're going to have an increase in IL-6 locally and then you have an increase in HSL. It's possible, but I don't think it requires systemic IL-6 per se. So
You're saying it could be a local phenomenon.
I'm saying it could be.
Okay, I mean that makes sense.
So
not
stepping
sure.
back.
Well, that could make sense, but that would then challenge the muscle-derived interleukin-6 model, Ben. I think Nick's paradigm probably has value. There's no question that the adipocytes can be producing IL-6 and then perhaps in an autocrine fashion be regulating their own lipolysis. But then that would challenge the relevance of the muscle-induced interleukin-6.
It would just be
add to it. Let's say add to it.
In addition, exactly.
Yeah.
I was going to say, yeah.
And I think stepping back, it's more like, okay, we can get into the weeds, but I think the bottom line is like, okay, the more time we maintain our muscle mass, keep our visceral fat down, the healthier we're going to be. I don't think any of us are going to disagree, no matter what the mechanism is.
Yeah. Hey guys, but let me tangent here. Ben, which book would you recommend of yours? Is it just this 15 Minutes to Fitness book? Is that the plan to look at?
Yeah, as far as what then?
Well, just to get, if I want to be ripped like Brian, if I'm getting.
You know what? I'm going to tell you something. I'm a gym guy, right? Basically, I have a couple of PhDs, but I'm a gym guy at heart. I would love to. I heard some of you. I heard you talking about doing leg day, right? And I got a kind of a kick out of it. I mean, I trained with some of the world's leading bodybuilders and powerlifters. I was neither, except I'm just an Italian guy. I'm just an Italian guy with a good muscle structure. But I would love to train you guys. And Nikki, I have some really interesting ideas about.
We could tangent to that. If we want to make me the subject, I'm totally game for that.
Yeah.
Because Nikki, I think that I'm a muscle fiber type dude. I mean, that's my bailiwick. Okay. I think that the reason that you don't get tired, okay, and that you don't put on muscle is probably the same reason. And I think it's because of your ability, inability, capacity, or limited capacity to stimulate up the strata of muscle fiber recruitment. And so we have to take that into consideration, not to get, again, too deep in the weeds, but I don't think your type 2B fibers are your basic promoters of growth. I think you're going to have to hypertrophy these muscle fiber types that are less normally hypertrophiable, okay, growing larger than other people. And I also think that's why you have such an incredible endurance situation, because you're not glycolytic, even in what we consider a hard, intense effort. Anyway.
Yeah, to catch everybody up, me and Bembo were talking before about, I've always had trouble putting on muscle of any type. It might have something to do, we were talking about this LRP5 gene variant that I have that causes me to store more visceral adipose tissue. There's also, it's one of the main source. I published a paper on this of my osteoporosis. Mm-hmm. Basically, my bones don't respond to mechanical stress in the way that they should. So I had no trouble, no fractures or whatsoever until I started running. First year of running, I could run 3,000 miles, no problem. But then I started getting fractures after that, and it got worse and worse. Right. Because my bones couldn't recover to the mechanical stress.
Yeah, I don't think protein synthesis of any kind is difficult for you, and it's reflected. Let's put it this way: it's reflected in, I think, your muscle fiber type distribution and utilization and the energy pathways involved in those things. I think, and therefore the metabolites. So I think, not to get too crazy, but I think that there's a puzzle I think I would like to solve, and I think I have.
Oh, I'm game to be your
guinea pig. The other thing is Benbo listens to the Pointer Sisters when he works out. We have it on video. That may have something to do with muscle hypertrophy too. I'm not sure. I have to check into it. I know he knows some secret he's not telling us, and he eats like a horse. I'm telling you, it's ridiculous.
So quizzing you, Ben, how would you adapt your program to fit someone like me?
Well, I mean, see, one thing I think, Nikki, is just the fact that you are capable of doing large amounts of exercise and not having many negative repercussions doesn't mean that that's the optimal way for you to achieve the objective that you're trying through your muscle system. Mm-hmm. In other words, just because you can do something doesn't mean it's a productive way to go about it. Let's put it simply, you're kind of freaky, okay? So you're an outlier, there's no question about it. But I think and my bailiwick is, how do I stimulate these different types of muscle fibers frequency, duration, okay, things like that, intensity, and how do I get my result that I'm trying to get? Now, some people don't want to get huge, stronger muscles, but most people do, in effect, want to promote the physiology of muscle growth, okay? Maybe the net outcome being different, but I don't know that really is the difference. So I think I think you do too much exercise because you can, but I think that there's a divergent pathways between volume and intensity, or relative intensity. Okay, those things bifurcate, and I think that maybe because you can do this with no apparent effect, I think the effect that you're really lacking is hypertrophy, because protein synthesis in your bones and muscle, which by the way are one functional unit, increase protein in one or decrease it in the other. I mean, they work in absolute correspondence. I think that could be that could be something that we could manipulate. Let's put it that way. I don't think I would give you the normal course of events and muscle fiber recruitment patterns.
I say you give him some health code and do Ben's workout and see what happens, man.
Yeah,
Use all that stuff and just see what happens, man.
And I could get Dr. Ben off of his his leg day and show him how in 14 minutes I could make his whole body grow, and then he can get like a paper route or something if you got extra time, Ben. I don't know.
Dr. Ben, do you want to do N=2 with?
Man, listen, Benbo, if you're, dude, give me. I sort of joke about leg day. More of my workouts nowadays are just sort of pure body weight kind of whole. Like today, I'm on the rings and I'm doing muscle ups, and then I try to do a lever front or back, and then I do pistol squats and kettlebell deep squats.
Let Ben teach you, man. Let Ben teach you. Hey, Ben.
I'd love to mix it up.
This is a Benbo quote. He says, "I can't make a rope out of string."
You don't have to do any of those. In other words, if you have to contort your body to work a muscle group, I think there are definitely easier, more effective, more efficient, more productive.
Oh, yeah. No, sorry. Let me clarify. My workouts nowadays are workouts where I want to accomplish a skill. Like I wanted to do a muscle up.
No, you're good. Okay, no, that's it. That's functional training. Okay.
Yeah. So it's less, that I want to do more weight or more reps.
No more weight. I mean, I'm talking about inducing the positive metabolic benefits of muscle fiber recruitment.
Oh, and don't get me wrong. I'd love to get some more hypertrophy, to be honest. I'm always on the kind of muscled end of scrawny. And it's worked.
I think I've seen you put muscle on just by watching you in the past couple of years than when you started. There's no question about it. Okay, I could see it. But my point is, and the same with what's his name, Teddy Naiman. I mean, Ted Naiman is an ectomorph, and I think rather than and he shows nice videos of him doing handstand push-ups on his thumbs or some ridiculous. Anyway, the point is, I think there are better ways to go about producing that which you want to, both cosmetically and metabolically.
Yeah.
What if you're like me and you're just a masochist and you like hurting yourself with that?
But you get positive reinforcement from being a masochist. A lot of people don't.
No, and I'm not one. To be honest, Ben, in defense of your view, my view on exercise is I want to get this thing done as efficiently as possible because I got other stuff I got to get to.
Yeah, no, Ben, I'm a minimalist, man. You could.
And he's a professor too. You could charge him double, Benny. We'll split it, man. I'll sign him up. Benny tells I make $50 a month off Benny. He goes, tell people you don't do my workout. I'm like, okay, I don't do his workout. $50. I get paid. He pays me not to. He goes, man, you're hurting my business.
I don't know Dr. Ben. I don't know him.
I think it might be a challenge for you. I have never in my life been able to get above a BMI of 22. And like with eating the shittiest diet you can imagine, like drinking jars of Nutella.
No, I
that level.
That would be interesting to see. I don't know. You're somehow defying the energy model somehow.
Brian, you've seen some of my patients, my clients. You saw Chucky, right? 66-year-old, and he's got that. He has a very limited ability to synthesize any kind of goddamn tissue.
He's the one I quoted you on that. You said you can't make a rope out of a string, right?
I can't make. He asked me, how come my arms aren't getting bigger? And I told him I can't make a rope out of string. I mean, I said, change your parents. But
what we should
I'll tell you guys, let me tell you one. And as a matter of fact, this is one of the things that messed with my brain, and Benny knows. I went to work out with Benny when he got inducted to the Fitness Hall of Fame. I'll give him one plug. It's a big deal. Jack LaLanne, some other guys like that. Pretty awesome. But I got to work out with him at his gym. and he had a guy work out, and he goes, Brian, ask this guy what he eats. And I thought he was pulling my leg. This guy's a beast, all muscle, 6-pack abs, just crushing this workout, and he's vegan. He's vegan, mostly fruit and a little bit. And I'm like, this is crazy. I go, Benny, this guy's got, he's sick. He just doesn't know it. Let me get a CGM. I get a CGM on the guy, and his sugars are all over the place, crazy, right? Because he's drinking like 44-ounce banana smoothies with juice and stuff, right? But he doesn't eat processed foods. He eats fruits and vegetables. That's it. So anyways, I get his labs back because I know it's gonna be bad. Insulin normal, triglycerides normal. Everything's normal on this kid. Everything's normal because he has such muscle mass. All that carb just goes to his muscle. Who cares? He doesn't have to. He's not spiking his insulin. His insulin is normal. Everything's fine. So I was like, him, good. But in 10 years, get back to me. I'll bet you he's gonna gain weight and he'll lose some muscle mass, and then he'll be mortal like the rest of us.
No,
I think
muscle creates an enormous buffer, or allows you to get away with a lot, just because it will so readily take in that glucose in response to insulin.
Yeah, absolutely. So he's not metabolically sick, so he get away with it. But I'm like, have people follow your insulin and lipids and triglycerides, see what happens, because over time, when you don't have that muscle mass, yeah, you'll be in trouble.
Well, you can't outrun a bad diet. I mean, I'm proof of that. But do you guys ever see the Game Changers documentary? Because one point you just made is like
documentary like this with quotes. Did you put quotes?
Yeah, quotes. They talked about they tried to spin it. This is what really irritated, that like, plants are good for health, but a lot of the focus was on athletic performance, and they try to conflate those two. But those are not the same thing. Like,
yeah, it's not the same thing. Totally.
Ripped and in the gym and be a vegan. And the hype, what killed it for me was at the very end, the last picture of the guy, I forget the guy's name. He had these big sideburns, but he was like some muscle person, and just a strong man. And the guy was obese. I think you could see he had visceral central adiposity, and they're promoting him as like the icon of veganism. And at the end, he's literally eating like pizzas, pasta, and a vegan burger all at the same time. But they're vegan, and he's at the same time being promoted as an icon of health and athletic performance. And you see him; he just looks like a fat dude, and he's eating like a Western diet type thing. And at the end, and that's the closing scene. And I'm just like,
well, I'll tell you, I don't like to get into battles, but I have a guy who took from a terrible vegan diet like that at Christmas time because his insulin level was like 48 or something ridiculous. Like, oh, you're in trouble. You cannot do what you're doing. You're done. You're in trouble. You're going to be, it's not, you will get diabetes. I guarantee it. So got him exercising, put him on a low carb diet, and he's lost 18 pounds since Christmas, normalized his blood pressure, his joints don't hurt. He feels great.
You got him eating meat?
I got him eating meat because
it wasn't another one, man.
It wasn't an ethical. It was an ethical problem. I'd say, look, we got to clean up your vegan diet, but because he would eat meat and eggs, like he's having eggs and meat now, and he's losing weight and he's feeling great. He's putting on muscle mass. So I think the reason I brought all you guys together is to say, okay, if Ben Bikman is saying is true, I want to decrease my visceral fat. If what Ben Bocchicchio is saying, I want to increase my muscle mass. And if Nick isn't answered, like he's going to store his visceral fat. So he's a guy, he can't get fat. He can't get like me because it's going to go visceral fat and he's going to be hosed metabolically. He's going to get into trouble. So interestingly enough, just to tie it all back in, one of my patients, we were talking and she's a surgical nurse, and I was telling her this stuff. She goes, "Oh my gosh, it's so weird you say that." He goes, "We just had this really thin guy, and we went in to get his appendix, and it was fat everywhere. We couldn't find his appendix. We're digging through fat trying to get to it. And sometimes we see, and I'm seeing this clinically also, where someone's 400 pounds and they have hardly any visceral fat. So it's like, oh my gosh.
Well, yeah, that's to me. In fact, Nick, I even wonder about your situation. This sounds like one form of lipodystrophy.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sure. Yeah.
Well, what genes should I look for? I have my entire genome on a VCF file. I can scan it for whatever.
I can't think of them off the top of my head. I'd have to look. Like AgPat may be one. PPAR gamma is another. But there are several known mutations that are causal to lipodystrophies. But that's what it sounds like, because to have essentially not that this is you, Nick, but Brian, the case that you just mentioned, to have such an exaggerated growth of visceral in the absence of any growth of subcutaneous, that is a lipodystrophy. That's not a typical.
It's a tophi. It's a tophi, right?
I think it's something. My personal opinion is it has something to do with this LRP5 variant. It wasn't actually. I was the one I documented it with respect to the bone stuff because it was a variant of unknown significance. I had a whole genome workup and like not like a 23andMe, like a whole genome workup. And I combed through it and I kind of hit the needle in the haystack early on. And so if there are other things, I mean, I have the 3 billion base pairs. If you email me some genes, I'll check them out.
Yeah.
And just a general offer, I have written 2 case reports on myself. I'm totally game for a third Ben Bow and Ben Bikman. If you're gonna direct me to some biomarkers and put me through an adapted form of your program, I'll write a paper and make you senior author. That'd be fun for
I
me.
don't care about that. That's,
I know, but
no, but I mean, I'm curious to work with, and then like I said, when I saw Ben and I was going to be on with him, I said, man, I could save this guy a lot of time. But again, the way to do, to be good at any particular movement is to do that particular movement. And
no. So Ben, you give me something to sink my teeth into, or I just am going to get your book right when we get done.
Yeah.
And I can still devote a little time each day just to practicing skills.
No, that's your skill training. Yeah, I got it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's not exercise. Ben will say that's not exercise. That's activity.
I love that distinction.
That's actually fun. That's performance training. There's a difference. Performance training is different than exercise, in my opinion. So, yeah, Benny, I'll just get your address. I'll send you a book. No big deal.
Yeah, you bet it, man.
Yeah, I have it in my to-read drawer. As soon as I finish this paper on FP4, it's like the next thing I'm just going to comb through. I'm excited.
Okay.
Yeah, so guys, it's great having you all. Ben Bikman's probably has to go spend time with his family and all that kind of stuff.
I will need to leave in about 10 minutes or so.
Yeah.
I know, Brian, it's almost like a punchline. If I got to go, it's because I got an obligation at home. It's ski season.
Oh, yeah.
Guys, and my wife is a skier, so she's up with my oldest, and then the 2 youngest are at home, probably destroying the home or tormenting the dog. So I'll need that.
That's good, man. Hey, you know what? I want to get all 3 of you. You guys are 3 of the smartest guys I know, really, in your areas, and I have a lot of respect, and I love you guys too. And I think it's really important for people to say, gosh, because what I want to do is give people hope to say, look, if you're not losing weight right away, don't give up. Like my patients, I'm like, let's walk it through. If you're putting muscle mass on, but you're losing visceral fat, you're going to live longer. You're going to be healthier. And so I'm thinking all of your contributions to science and to medicine and to what I do, it's really critical, right? Because I tease Ben that he's the missing link, but he's the missing link to what we're talking about, because everyone keto said, oh, exercise doesn't matter, because historically people would exercise and they wouldn't lose weight because they just eat twice as much food, right? When you're doing Ben's workout and you're fasting and you're doing, so obviously what you guys are doing is working. And so I think it's really important for people to hear, hey, if I don't lose 30 pounds, because everyone thinks, oh, I go keto, I lose 30 pounds the first week, right? If you have a terrible diet, you might lose, water weight and insulin, regulated types, or quit drinking. So I think it's important for people to hear that. I know, Nick, you're on the other side of the spectrum trying to gain weight and muscle mass. So I think it's, I think we really have to, I think we've confounded weight and health to a degree, because people think, they look at someone, they go, this person's in bad shape. And I'm telling you, I see people that are 350, 400 pounds with normal insulin, normal lipids, and all that, because they're storing a ton of subcutaneous fat. So I think we have to really reassess when we say someone's healthy, that they're not healthy until we get the numbers and look at their visceral fat in numbers. I think that's one thing we kind of agree on.
From a clinical perspective, I think that's super important, but even more important is from a societal perspective. I mean, I have been personally the victim of that stereotype, you're skinny, you're healthy. And if you're walking around and you're thin, like, people don't understand, like, look, I'm concerned about my ApoE4 status and the fact that I preferentially store visceral fat. And there's this pressure to, like, oh, you're thin, why aren't you having cake, you weirdo? Like, you're making everybody else feel awkward. There's just this weird, culture around it. Like, you can't, if you're somebody who intermittent fasts, go out and just fast. And I don't know when that, culture, that food culture will change. I'm hoping in my lifetime, but it's just a little bit broken. And I think that's what prevents a lot of people from adopting, healthy lifestyle interventions. So, like, they don't actually mind the intervention, but it's the social pressure that kills it.
Well, and the other way too, because people are afraid to eat a steak and eggs when everyone's looking at like, oh, no wonder you're 300 pounds, right? So Tro also have that stuff too. So those of us trying to go the other way, people look at you go like, why are you eating that way? Why aren't you eating the bread? Yeah, like, it's healthy whole wheat. Why aren't you having? So as a doc, it's hard for me to say, yeah, you have diabetes. Probably not a good idea to have oatmeal every morning with a banana and orange juice. It's not a good number. It's not good for you. Trust me on this one, right? And when they have the continuous glucose monitor, all the things that we have, they can see their health getting better. And I think, again, looking at, tying a string around your waist to see what your metabolic health is. And I think it's important to note when I was researching it, it's not that the ketogenic diet specifically causes you to lose visceral fat. Any way you lose weight, you're losing visceral fat first, it looks like, from based on what I'm seeing in the literature. But the other thing on the way out, I would just love to throw this out to you guys, is when we see weight plateaus sometimes, right? People lose weight and then boom, they plateau for a long time and then boom, they lose it again. Could that be switching from subcutaneous to visceral, subcutaneous? Do we go back and forth or is there a certain threshold we hit with visceral fat when your body goes, okay, I'm burning enough visceral, let's switch to subQ for a while and then we'll switch back? I don't know. But I'm thinking we're going to learn a lot in that. Ben, the smart Ben over here is shaking his head no.
Well, no, I'm saying I don't know. I don't think it would be a matter of shifting between fuel depots. I do maintain the view I mentioned earlier, which is the body's going to want to burn through the visceral earlier. I say that as if the body, visceral adipocytes do undergo lipolysis more rapidly than subcutaneous. So I would say a person will probably typically lose visceral adipose first and then subcutaneous adipose. Then I would say any plateauing at that point would be a matter of a subcutaneous plateau. But then what would get them off the plateau? I don't know. I don't know that I could think of a general concept behind it.
So Ben, do you have any idea about the mitochondrial density in the different types of fat? I know between brown and white, but between visceral and subcutaneous, that's I'm just curious.
Yeah. So in an unstimulated situation, and I guess by that I would mean maybe the absence of ketones, because that's what I have familiarity with. The mitochondrial content is similar between the two depots.
Okay.
It's just that the subcutaneous appears to be able to induce a greater degree of mitochondrial biogenesis and uncoupling, which is a totally novel, it's totally unique, because while the visceral adipocyte is undergoing lipolysis more readily, the subcutaneous adipocyte is undergoing uncoupling more readily, using perhaps its own fuel, just very inefficiently, but ideally in this situation. And so each has their own sort of selective advantage when it comes time to shrinking the fat cell.
Okay, that's cool. That's good knowledge. Yeah.
In the Liu et al. Study that I was referencing about the visceral adipose tissue, one of the things they found was what they knocked out TRPR2 in these mice. There was an increase in UCP1 and PGC1 alpha expression. I think
in the visceral.
Yeah, so both.
Interesting.
Which would be uncoupling and mitochondrial biogenesis.
Yep, you're right. Sure would.
So, again, mouse model, I think you had a valid point there. But I definitely, before we close, I just wanted I have 2 hours of education on this topic, really, between when we finished the LowCarbMD podcast this morning and now. But I was just thinking about practical things for people. And I wanted to throw out what I think is most practical with respect to reducing visceral adiposity, other than just, the basic and the obvious. But, the exercise, for one, that's basic and obvious I was thinking about this inflammatory signature IL-6. There were also weird things with this MALA-T1 gene and microRNA 382-3P. That probably is way too esoteric. But anyway.
Esoteric, man. We'll talk about it later.
Okay.
We got to figure this stuff out. Ben's got to go skiing.
But the resistant piece seem to tie together the alcohol and the inflammatory diet. Obesogenic diets and alcohol, but they both impact resistance, which correlates well with visceral fat. So, avoiding alcohol. There was one study that was if you're going to have alcohol, have it in small doses over the course of the week rather than having big boluses. I forget what that study was. Probably just a correlational study. But
I can tell you from experience, it makes sense, and weight gain does happen from alcohol intake.
Yeah.
Mind you, boys, I'm a teetotaler. I've never had a single
it's always
drop
Benny
in
over
my
here,
life.
little Benny. That's why you guys are all cut.
I've had
learning.
I've had wait, this is funny stories. I don't drink either, but I've had alcohol twice. Once on my 21st birthday, and I had one drink. It was a tequila sunrise. It was very fruity, and I liked it. And then
That just sounds funny, Nick. It was fruity, and you liked it.
Oh well, it was. I just like
Yeah.
I anyway. The other time, and I've gotten kind of tipsy drunk once, was during final seasons at Dartmouth, because Dartmouth imposed while I was there a hard alcohol ban. And there's one liquor that I can even stand the taste of. It's called Amberula, and it's from South Africa. It's the one that like fermented these. It's kind of like Kahlua. It's creamy, but the elephants get drunk on it. Anyway, it was like 32 proof, and I just had gotten it. My mom had sent me like a couple bottles to share with my friends. We were like 19, 20, so we were underage. But they then put the hard alcohol ban in, and I'm like, crap, I can't get caught with hard alcohol. Like, this is terrible. Like, me getting like whatever expelled, I was, overreacting. But then I'm like, I have to get rid of it. But I really hate wasting anything, and it was finals period, and so all term my friends have been like, oh, come drinking with us. I'm like, I don't really do that, and now nobody will drink with me because it's finals period. So I drink the whole thing.
Yeah, I'm good.
That's
That's natural
around.
consequences. Watch the other podcast with me and Ben. We'll tell you about natural consequences. Hey man, Nick.
Oh,
you got papers to read.
I do have papers
Ben's
to read.
got to go skiing, and
Yeah, I gotta go.
All right.
I gotta go.
Benbo's
pick up a
got
couple
stuff to do,
kids.
man.
I killed my practicality rant with that. But anyway, yeah, that
It's
was
all
the one
good.
time I got drunk. Apparently, I started philosophizing about black holes. That's what I'm.
Yeah,
like,
he's talking about. He goes, "Let's
I'm
keep
like,
it simple." And he starts talking about all these chemical processes. Man, my brain doesn't work that way, man.
Ryan,
You guys
hey,
got to draw
listen,
me a
Ryan,
picture.
thanks for arranging this. This was fun. This
No,
was,
thanks, guys.
was real
Thank you
great.
guys
I
all.
loved it.
to make
This
these
is-
connections.
Oh, this is great
for
because I
me.
know you guys will all figure this stuff out and go, "Okay, Brian, here's what you do. Just tell them this, and then I can
an honor
go and
to
do
be
it."
with you guys. I feel like
Yeah.
Everybody stay
Same.
well.
Awesome stuff, guys.
thank
Hey,
you so
everyone,
much.
thanks for listening. This is gold. This is like awesome stuff. This is cutting edge. I'm telling you, these guys know their stuff. So it's great to have friends like this that I could pick up the phone and go, "What the heck am I seeing, guys?" And then they could tell me if I'm nuts or not. And when Ben Bikman says I 100% I agree with you, then I feel happy with my life and I feel like I've accomplished something. So
Oh man,
no, but thank you
that's
all.
a low
And Nick
bar,
too.
brother.
You guys are
It's a low
all
bar.
doing great
Thanks,
stuff,
guys.
man.
Take
All
care.
right.
Thank you so much. It was awesome to be here.
Yep. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Oh, here, let me stop recording.
Stop.
Awesome, guys.
Yeah, good.